Welcome to your custom deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that sounds simple on the surface, but it gets surprisingly complex when you really start to poke at it. What is management? And I don't just mean the how-to guides or even, the different schools of thought. We're going deeper, right down to the philosophical bedrock.
That's right. This deep dive is all about the ontology of management. And ontology, well, it's the study of being, isn't it? Of existence. So when we talk about the ontology of management, we're asking about its fundamental nature. How does it even exist? What are the underlying assumptions that make us think of it as a distinct thing at all?
And our source material for this, it's essentially a set of lecture notes covering this exact topic. They're kind of our map for this exploration.
Yeah, they lay it out pretty clearly.
So our mission today, to unpack the core ideas from these notes, we want to challenge some assumptions, maybe assumptions you hold about what management is.
Understand the different philosophical lenses you can view it through, and ultimately show why this kind of deep theoretical question actually has very real implications for how management is practiced.
And how you experience it day to day.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dive in then. At its absolute core, this ontology of management, it's this philosophical quest, right? To understand its nature, its existence.
It's about asking those really big foundational questions, like, is management something objectively out there in the world, like a rock or, a scientific law just waiting for us to discover and measure it?
Or is it something different, something we've collectively sort of made up?
A set of ideas, practices that only exist because we as humans agree they do. A social construct.
And how does the being of management itself relate to things we often bundle with it, like power or control, leadership even?
Are they just ingredients you add to management? Or are they fundamentally part of what management is, woven right into its fabric?
It's fascinating because digging into this starts to reveal all the hidden assumptions, the ones buried deep inside every management theory you've ever come across.
Mm-hmm. Whether it's about optimizing workflows or empowering teams, each approach sort of secretly carries a belief about the basic nature of management, what it fundamentally is.
So, okay, why does this matter to you, the listener? Why get into the philosophy of it all?
Well, first off, it really forces you to examine your own beliefs, your own maybe unconscious assumptions about management. We all operate with them, right?
Yeah.
About motivation, about structures, decision making.
Sure.
Understanding the ontology helps you see where those might come from. Are they universally true? Or just one particular way of looking at things?
And if you can start to question those foundational ideas, well, it genuinely opens the door to thinking about management in totally new ways.
Which could lead to completely different practices, maybe better ones than the ones we often rely on.
Right. It gives you a framework almost for evaluating any management theory or trend you encounter.
Exactly. And instead of just asking, does this technique work? You can ask a deeper question. What does this theory assume management actually is?
And does that assumption line up with what you see, with your own understanding or reality?
Mm-hmm.
So the source notes, they lay out three main perspectives on this. Three different answers to that core question. We've got the objectivist perspective, the constructivist, and the critical perspective.
Right. Let's start with the one that probably feels most traditional, or maybe intuitive for a lot of people. That's the objectivist perspective.
Okay. And this view basically says management is an objective reality. It exists out there independent of us, like gravity, you said. It's just there, whether we see it or believe in it or not.
Precisely. And this lines up really well with those older classical management theories, the ones that emphasize management as a rational, measurable, controllable process.
So the key ideas here are things like rationality.
Yeah, decisions based purely on logic, evidence, objectivity.
Universality too, right? The idea that management principles should apply everywhere.
That's a big part of it. That there are discoverable laws of management, almost like laws of nature. You find them through scientific methods, logical analysis.
And studying management from this view should be neutral, objective, like studying physics or biology.
You can see this very clearly in things like scientific management. Frederick Taylor, for instance.
Time and motion studies.
Exactly. His whole focus wasn't just about boosting efficiency. It was rooted in this deep assumption that there was an objectively best way to do any job. And you can find it through scientific analysis. Workers, in this view, were seen largely through that lens of economic rationality. Objective inputs, predictable outputs.
And Max Weber's work on bureaucracy also fits this mold, doesn't it?
It does. He described things like hierarchy, formal rules, specialization.
Yeah.
Not just as a possible ways to organize, but as the rational, the most efficient form for modern organizations.
Based on what he called legal rational authority.
Right. It assumes there's a knowable, designable structure for managing complex tasks efficiently.
Although he did have that warning, didn't he, about the potential downside?
He did, the famous iron cage metaphor. The potential for these very rational systems to become dehumanizing, which shows a kind of tension even within that seemingly straightforward rational view.
Even something like systems theory, when applied in a very strict way, can lean towards this objectivist side.
Yeah, viewing organizations as complex, sure, but ultimately analyzable systems. Inputs, processes, outputs, things you can scientifically understand and manage using feedback loops and analysis.
Okay, so that's the objectivist view, rational, universal, discoverable. But the notes also point out some pretty significant criticism.
They do. I mean, if management is truly objective and universal, why do things like culture, emotions, values, why do they always seem to, well, complicate things?
Exactly. Critics argue this view really overemphasizes pure logic. It tends to ignore the messy, subjective human element that's always present.
And that idea of universality. It feels a bit shaky in practice, doesn't it? Does managing a tech startup in, say, Silicon Valley really follow the exact same fundamental principles as managing a nonprofit in rural India?
Probably not quite the same.
Seems unlikely. Which leads us neatly into the second perspective, the constructivist perspective. And this offers a very different answer to what management is.
Okay, so if it's not out there waiting to be found,
then maybe it's something we create together as humans interacting.
So management as a social construct.
Exactly. It's built through our interactions, our shared beliefs, our values, even the language we use within organizations. It's not objective. It's inherently subjective and is constantly being shaped and reshaped.
So management isn't some fixed thing. It's meaning, it's practice. It's all being negotiated, influenced by social dynamics.
Power relations play a huge role here too. And the dominant ways of talking about things is the discourse within a specific context. Language isn't just a tool to describe management. It actively shapes what management is in that particular place and time.
You can see that, can't you? Think about how a specific company culture defines what good management looks like. It's not usually based on some universal law discovered in a lab. It's built on shared stories, values, interactions over years.
Okay. And the examples the notes give here include things like postmodernism and organizational studies. Postmodern thinkers really challenge that idea of a single objective organizational reality. They emphasize how multiple perspectives, multiple truths exist, often shaped by power dynamics. And that includes truths about what management is and does.
Critical management studies, CMS, also draws on this idea, doesn't it?
It does. CMS often argues that management theories and practices aren't neutral. They often serve specific interests, and their apparent reality is constructed through language, discourse, and power.
So the way we talk about management actually helps create it.
In a sense, yes. And another interesting example is actor network theory, or ANT. ANT takes this idea of construction even further. It looks at organizations and therefore management as networks, but not just networks of people.
What else is in the network?
Well, objects, technologies, ideas, reports, they're all seen as actors alongside humans. And they're all constantly interacting, negotiating, and co-producing the reality of the organization.
So management isn't just about a person in charge.
Less about that, and more about a dynamic outcome of all these interactions within the network. It's quite a different way of seeing it.
All right, so this constructivist view definitely gives us a richer, maybe more nuanced picture. It brings in all the social and cultural stuff the objectivist view tends to miss.
But it also means management becomes less neatly defined, right? Less universally applicable, more context dependent.
Which kind of sets the stage for the third perspective.
The critical perspective, yes. This view often builds on some of the ideas in constructivism, but it goes further. It actively questions and challenges the dominant ways management is understood and practiced, often with a focus on power.
So it assumes management isn't just a neutral tool or even just a social agreement.
Right. It sees management as often deeply intertwined with existing power structures, with inequality, sometimes even with exploitation.
And the goal is to uncover the hidden ideologies, the hidden interests that management practices might be serving.
Precisely. A core element is power analysis, really digging into how power is distributed and used in organizations, how it maintains hierarchies, how it controls people.
And there's a strong ethical dimension too.
Very much so. A focus on social justice, trying to identify and challenge discrimination, marginalization, unfairness that might be embedded within management structures or practices themselves.
It uses something called ideology critique.
Yeah, analyzing the underlying assumptions and beliefs within management theories, asking that crucial question, whose interests do these ideas actually serve? Who benefits?
And it's also concerned with resistance.
Right, resistance and empowerment. Looking at how individuals or marginalized groups can push back against oppressive structures or practices within organizations.
What are some examples from the notes here?
Well, things like feminist management studies. This field examines how gendered assumptions get built into organizational roles, into management practices, often leading to the marginalization or disadvantage of women.
Makes sense.
Then there's post-colonial management studies. This looks at the legacy of colonialism, how it might still shape management practices and power dynamics, especially in global organizations, potentially perpetuating old inequalities.
And critical race theory applied to management.
Yes, looking specifically at how race and racism can be embedded, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, within organizational structures, processes, promotion systems, influencing who gets ahead and how management is experienced by people from different racial backgrounds.
So this critical lens, it provides a really vital counterpoint, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It pushes us to see management not just as a technical process or even just a social one, but as a potential site of power struggles, ethical dilemmas, and social inequality.
Okay, so we have these three really distinct ways of seeing management: objective reality, social construct, or system of power. Just laying them out like that highlights some of the inherent difficulties, the challenges in studying the ontology of management itself.
Absolutely. One huge challenge is precisely this issue of subjectivity and interpretation. Since management is so deeply human, so influenced by context, values, perceptions, achieving those neat, objective, universal frameworks, it feels incredibly difficult. Maybe impossible, depending on which perspective you lean towards.
Yeah, what one person sees as, decisive leadership.
Someone else might see as authoritarian control. Same actions, different interpretation. The actual being of that management act is perceived differently.
Then there's the sheer complexity and dynamic nature of organizations.
They're not static things. They're constantly changing, evolving, reacting to their environment. How do you pin down the fundamental being of something that's always in flux? Static definitions struggle.
And the fact that we even have these very different competing perspectives.
Right. Objectivist, constructivist, critical. They offer fundamentally different answers. That makes finding any kind of consensus really challenging. If we can't agree on what management is, how can we agree on the best way to study it or teach it or even practice it?
The role of values and ethics also keeps coming up.
It's unavoidable. Management decisions are rarely just about facts. They involve judgments about fairness, about what's right, what's a good outcome. It's incredibly hard to separate the is of management from the ought, the facts from the values.
And finally, the notes mention the challenge of generalization.
Yes. We naturally want theories that help us understand management broadly across different situations. But the reality we experience is often so specific to the context, the industry, the national culture, the particular people involved.
So how do you balance that? How do you create general knowledge about something that seems so fundamentally context dependent?
It's a constant tension in the field. These problems aren't necessarily solvable in a simple way, but recognizing them is crucial. It highlights the ongoing debate and why we need to be cautious about applying any single perspective too rigidly or universally.
Okay, so thinking about the field itself, the ontology of management, you said it emerged as a distinct area of study relatively recently, latter half of the 20th century, maybe?
Yeah, really taking shape alongside things like critical theory's rise in social sciences.
Right.
But the questions it asks, the fundamental questions about reality, human nature, how societies work, they have much deeper roots.
Going way back.
Oh, yes. Back to ancient philosophical debates.
The source notes actually trace some of these early influences from philosophy, which is quite fascinating.
It is. For instance, you could look at Plato. His ideas about forms these ideal underlying principles behind the messy reality we see.
Could that be seen as a kind of precursor to the objectivist search for universal management principles?
You could argue that, yeah. And his discussions on justice and virtue in the Republic, they relate directly to questions about the ethical nature of leadership and organization. What should management be? That's an ontological question about its purpose and ideal state.
In Aristotle?
Well, his theory of causation, you could apply that. What are the fundamental causes or drivers that bring organizations into being and sustain them? And his focus on eudaimonia, human flourishing, living virtuously, that suggests the purpose and therefore the fundamental nature or being of organizations and management should contribute to human well-being. It adds a kind of ethical or teleological dimension to the ontology. What is management for?
Jumping way ahead now, but still in philosophy, Descartes.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That emphasis on the individual mind and rational inquiry definitely underpins the focus on rationality we see in the objectivist view of management.
And his methodological doubt.
That encourages the kind of critical thinking needed to question assumptions, which is central to ontological inquiry. Even his mind matter dualism, while abstract, could spark thoughts about how the abstract ideas of management plans, strategies, relate to the concrete reality of organizational life.
And Kant, his ethics seem relevant.
Absolutely. The categorical imperative, the idea of acting according to principles you can will to be universal laws, that provides a powerful philosophical basis for thinking about universal ethical principles in management decision-making. Again, touching on that normative aspect, what kind of being should management strive for?
So these philosophers weren't talking about management as we know it, but they were laying groundwork for how to think about reality, reason, ethics, purpose.
Exactly. And then much later, you get classical management thought in the early 20th century. People like Taylor, Fayol, Weber. They weren't explicitly doing ontology. They weren't asking what is management in a philosophical sense.
But they were defining it, weren't they? Through principles, analysis, structures.
Precisely. They were providing the initial frameworks, the initial conceptions of management as something systematic, something that could be studied and improved. Fayol's principles, Taylor's scientific analysis, Weber's description of bureaucracy as a rational form built on legal rational authority.
They gave later thinkers something concrete to build on or maybe react against.
Exactly. Weber's bureaucracy, for example, isn't just a set of rules. It's a description of a specific form of organizational existence, a specific way management is in modern society.
So when did the explicit ontological inquiry emerge as its own field?
That really took off with movements like critical management studies, CMS, in the 1970s and 80s.
Okay.
CMS scholars were the ones who started explicitly questioning the seemingly neutral, objective picture of management presented by the classical and mainstream views. They started asking about power, ideology, whose reality counts.
Which directly raises ontological questions, right? What is the nature of organizational power? How is management knowledge constructed? Is it objective or subjective?
Exactly. And postmodernism, arriving around the same time or a bit later, also fueled this by questioning grand narratives, objective truth, and emphasizing language, discourse, and power.
It really bolstered the constructivist perspective's claims about how management reality is shaped.
Definitely. So fast forward to recent developments. The field is becoming even more diverse. We see more perspectives being incorporated: critical theory, post-structuralism, feminist theory, and so on.
And it's becoming more interdisciplinary too.
Very much so. Drawing insights from sociology, anthropology, psychology, philosophy, trying to get a fuller picture of this really complex human phenomenon we call management.
And the interesting thing is, you mentioned this earlier, while it sounds very abstract and philosophical,
is finding practical applications.
Yeah, informing things like how we design organizations, how we develop leaders, how we manage change. Because how you fundamentally define management inevitably shapes how you do management.
Makes perfect sense.
The notes also touch on some other key thinkers and contributions that add more layers to this whole picture.
Right. For example, systems theory and cybernetics. Pioneers like Ludwig von Bertalanffy with general systems theory and Norbert Wiener with cybernetics.
How do they fit into the ontology?
Well, they offered a way to view organizations not just as static structures or collections of individuals, but as complex, dynamic systems, interconnected processes. That fundamentally changes the ontological view, what the organization is.
And cybernetics, with its focus on control and communication.
Right. Applying that to organizations asks fundamental questions about how coordinated action actually happens. Is the essence of management hierarchical control, or is it about information flow, feedback loops, self-regulation? Wiener's work also brings in ideas about the impact of AI and automation, changing the very nature of work and control.
Then there's contingency theory, people like Lawrence and Lorsch.
Their core idea that the best management approach depends on the specific situation. The context also has clear ontological implications.
Because it challenges that objectivist idea of universal principles.
Exactly. It suggests that the fundamental, effective nature of management isn't fixed. It is in part its ability to adapt. Its being is contingent on environment, technology, culture. What management is changes depending on where and when it is.
And circling back to the more constructivist or critical side, the notes mention thinkers like Michel Foucault.
Yes, Foucault's work on power and knowledge is hugely influential. How they're inseparable, how they shape social practices and institutions like management through discourse. What we know and say about management shapes what it becomes.
And Jacques Derrida, deconstruction.
His approach encourages us to pull apart the language of management theory, find the hidden assumptions, the binary oppositions like manager-worker, rational-emotional, and see the power dynamics embedded within them. Again, questioning the taken-for-granted reality, and maybe one more, Nicholas Luhmann and his social systems theory, particularly the concept of autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis, that sounds complex.
It is, but it offers a really radical ontological view. Luhmann saw organizations not primarily as collections of people or structures, but as self-referencing, self-organizing social systems.
And what's the key element?
Communication. For Luhmann, the fundamental operation of an organization is communication. It creates itself through communication. Management, in this view, isn't about people directing things so much as it is the specific kind of communication within the system that observes the system and guides its internal processes.
Wow. So management is a type of communication within a self-creating system.
In essence, yes. It's a fascinating, very abstract way to define the being of an organization and its management. Very different from Taylor or even Foucault.
Okay, these thinkers really push the boundaries, don't they? They show just how many fundamentally different ways there are to answer that seemingly simple question. What is management?
And which way you lean, whether you see it more as an objective science to be discovered, a collective agreement we negotiate, or a system of power relations to be navigated or challenged. That really does shape everything else. How you think about work, leadership, organizations, your own role. It all stems back, in part, to that foundational ontological assumption.
Wow, okay. That was quite the journey through the philosophy of management. We started by defining the ontology of management, this deep philosophical dive into its fundamental nature, using those lecture notes as our guide. We saw why it's not just some academic exercise. It genuinely challenges your assumptions, can open up new possibilities for practice, and sharpens your critical thinking about any management approach.
We went through those three main perspectives. The objectivist view, seeing management as this rational, universal, perhaps discoverable reality.
And then the constructivist view, arguing, no, it's a social reality we build together through interaction and language.
And the critical view, pushing further to uncover the power dynamics, the inequalities, the hidden ideologies that might be embedded within management itself.
We also traced the history of it, saw how ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle laid some very early groundwork for thinking about ethics, purpose, and organization.
How classical thinkers like Taylor, Fayol, and Weber started to systematize it, giving us concrete forms to analyze.
And then how later movements, especially critical management studies and postmodernism, really brought the explicit ontological questions, what is this thing, right to the forefront.
Leading to today's really diverse, interdisciplinary field, borrowing ideas from everywhere.
And we touched on other key thinkers and theories too. Systems theory, contingency theory, Foucault, Luhmann, each offering yet another angle on that fundamental question of what management truly is.
It's a lot to take in, definitely.
It is. So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to take away and perhaps mull over as you go about your work life. Based on these incredibly different ways of viewing management as a science, as a social agreement, as a power system, how does just thinking about which of these feels most true or maybe most useful to you, how does that potentially change how you approach your own role, whether you're managing or being managed, how you interpret what's happening around you?
Yeah, how does shifting your understanding of management's fundamental being actually change your day-to-day experience of it?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.